In the mid-20th century, the Swedish economy relied on a highly mobilized physical workforce. Men routinely worked deep into their 60s, even in demanding industrial and manufacturing sectors. This chart plots the labor force participation rate for Swedish men between the ages of 60 and 64. In 1963, the baseline shows that 85% of men in this age bracket were actively employed. Over the next 4 decades, that participation rate falls away. By the year 2000, only 57% of older men remained in the labor market. But immediately after that year 2000 trough, the trend reverses. The participation rate climbs back toward its historical peak, pushing past 75% today. Concurrently, older women, who had been steadily entering the workforce over the exact same period, converge with the men, meeting at the top right of the recovery curve. This 50-year U-shaped trajectory provides a controlled macroeconomic environment. By analyzing it, we can determine the forces driving aging populations out of the economy and identify the levers pulling them back in. To dissect this phenomenon, we have to adjust our methodology. Instead of tracking general calendar years, we must measure data by specific birth cohorts to see how conditions changed for each generation reaching their early 60s. Economists propose 4 main hypotheses to explain this return to work: rising human capital, easier jobs, working spouses, and institutional pension reform. By aligning the timeline of these 4 variables against the precise year 2000 inflection point of our U-curve, we can separate mere coincidence from causation. Testing these variables will reveal whether the modern labor force is defined by organic demographic capacity or engineered by institutional incentives. We begin with the first hypothesis: demographic capacity. The premise is that modern populations became healthier and better educated, granting them the ability to work later into life. This graph tracks mortality rates as a baseline proxy for population health. In the 1960s, male mortality rates were high and stagnant. However, beginning in the 1980s, we see a significant health improvement. For men aged 60 to 64, mortality more than halves by 2005. Self-assessed mobility surveys corroborate this survival data. The share of 60-year-olds physically capable of running a 100-meter sprint surged from 50% in 1968 to nearly 80% by 2010. Intellectual capacity expanded alongside physical health. During this same era, Sweden experienced a massive generational shift in schooling. The cohorts reaching their 60s in the early 2000s possessed higher rates of high school and university degrees compared to previous generations. Statistically, higher educational attainment strongly correlates with delayed retirement. The data confirms older Swedes were indeed healthier and more educated. The flaw in the hypothesis lies in the timing. These improvements in mortality and education were gradual, secular trends spanning decades. Better health and advanced degrees provided the physical and intellectual capacity to work longer. But a smooth, multi-decade trend cannot explain a sudden rise in labor force participation that starts specifically in the year 2000. The second hypothesis suggests that the transition to a knowledge economy, replacing factory floors with office desks, kept older workers employed by removing physical friction. This chart tracks fatal workplace accidents. In 1970, male fatalities were high, reflecting a dangerous industrial era. Over the next 2 decades, hazards plunge. By 1990, fatal accidents and physical demands dropped dramatically, reaching a low plateau by the late 1990s. Overlaying the labor force participation curve against the timeline of workplace improvement highlights a direct mismatch. During the window when heavy lifting and fatal hazards vanished, older men left the workforce at the fastest rate in recorded history. By the time labor participation finally spiked upward in the year 2000, physical job demands had been flat for nearly a decade, offering no new momentum to pull workers back in. The modernization of the workplace coincided with the era of early retirement. Decreasing physical demands did not delay retirement. The greatest exodus from the labor market happened alongside the decline of hazardous work. The third test examines household economics, whether the historic influx of women into the workforce anchored husbands to their jobs to synchronize their eventual retirements. In countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, empirical data shows that a wife's retirement status significantly affects her husband's decision to remain in or exit the labor force. This maps a husband's retirement against his wife's workforce entry, shifting her timeline 20 years right to reflect their age gap. Notice the massive female labor surge in the 1980s and 90s, exactly when male participation hit its deepest slump. Sweden's workforce feminized a full decade earlier than the Anglo-American model. Husbands in the late 20th century were retiring early, despite their wives working in record numbers. While dual incomes rewrite household economics, the timeline mismatch indicates that shifting marital dynamics cannot explain the post-2000 employment surge. This leaves the fourth variable, institutional reform. We must identify a direct economic catalyst to activate the demographic capacity we established earlier. Prior to 1998, Sweden operated on a defined benefit pension plan. In this system, retirement payouts were calculated using a formula based on a worker's highest earning 15 years. This created a specific incentive structure. Once a worker reached their 15 best years, working additional time past the age of 60 generated almost no increase in their final pension payout. This flowchart contrasts the old structure with the system that replaced it. In 1998, Sweden transitioned to a notional defined contribution, or NDC plan. Rather than pooling funds into a capped formula, money flowed directly into strictly proportional individual accounts. This created actuarial fairness. Every single payroll tax contribution directly increased the final payout. It introduced mathematical penalties for retiring early and applied compounding bonuses for delaying retirement. The policy was phased in based on birth year. The cohort born in 1938 was the first to face partial exposure to the new rules, with the policy scaling up by 5% each year until reaching full implementation for the 1954 cohort. This overlay visualizes the rollout schedule of the pension reform against our U-curve. As the percentage of exposure to the new system scales up for each birth cohort, their exact labor force participation rate tracks upward in tandem. 40 years of early retirement trends reversed. The catalyst was the alignment of individual labor with actuarial reward. Complex macroeconomic shifts are rarely driven by a single variable, but mapping the data allows us to separate passive context from active triggers. The assumption that easier jobs and modern technology keep aging populations employed is not supported by the timeline. The exodus of older workers happened precisely as those conditions improved. Improvements in health, mobility, and education were critical. They built a reservoir of untapped labor potential, a generation physically and mentally capable of working later in life. But capacity is inert without structural incentive. The 1998 shift to the notional defined contribution pension was the spark that moved the demographic fuel. The data proves that precise tax and benefit architecture dictates human behavior at a national scale. The high participation rate in the modern Swedish labor force is a deliberate policy outcome, achieved by removing effort caps and directly rewarding continued employment. As populations age globally, governments cannot wait for the changing nature of work to naturally retain their aging labor base. They must mathematically